Welcome to the NPTEL MOOC course on Phonetics and Phonology, a broad overview. So, I am continuing with Unit 4, that is speech perception, and in the last class we talked quite a bit about perceiving speech and the segmentation problem, that the segmentation is the perception of silence between words, and how we use cues, how human beings use cues as aspects of the signal that contain minimal recoverable acoustic information necessary for the listener to recover a contrast. And also this categorical perception. So, people that we hear speech categories rather than the small acoustic variations. Category boundaries therefore reflect general auditory sensitivities. And also we looked at voice onset time, which is one of the most important things that you would study when you study categorical perception. So, here we are showing VOT, release of closure of the consonant, and when voicing starts. So, depending on when the voicing will start, you will hear a consonant as voiced or voiceless, and you saw in the last class that if it is there could be between 20 and 25 milliseconds in this experiment, there could be a category change, and that is and the experimental results showed that almost 100% of the subjects gave a positive response within that category boundary, and they would never hear an in-between category, and they would hear only one category or the other category and nothing in between. So, this is what we saw in the last class. So, we saw identification and also saw discrimination. So, in identification, as we said in the last class, this is forced identification. So, participants are asked to identify based on orthography whether something is ba or pa, but in discrimination functions it is not based on orthography. So, speakers hear a sound and would have to identify something as that sound or another sound. And also these both these experiments merge in the findings of a category boundary. So, it is either ba on one side and pa on the other side, but speakers never hear an in-between category. And apart from voice onset time and categorical perception, we also saw co-articulation, how form and transitions can change based on the following vowels. And these are three consonants, and we saw that irrespective of whether it is the same consonant or not, depending on the following vowel, transitions could be different. So, a ba has different transition from a b, and similarly so across consonants also b is different from gi and gi is different from d. So, both across vowels and across consonants there are differences in form and transitions. So, we have a lot of variability in the signal, and it seems people are sensitive to these variations. So, speech perception essentially is it's a problem, it can be called as a listener's problem. So, how do you extract the most important information from the speech signal, from the acoustic signal? What is the process which is responsible for extracting the most crucial information? And it involves recognition of words, and because that extraction will lead to the differences between words, recognition of the words, and also help in making the contrast between two sounds, ba, pa, the, g, the, pa, the, th, etc. And a lot of the speech perception research has shown that speech perception cues are the ones which help people to make those distinctions. So, production studies show consistent VOT differences between voiced and voiceless. And as we saw in the first few slides, that between 20 to 25 milliseconds, and that's also shown in production studies. So how is it tested? Perceptual significance experiments manipulate the acoustic property synthetically or edit it, and see if perceptual response is affected. So VOT, suppose VOT in CV syllables, and it can also be done by naturally editing produced sounds, and listeners are asked to classify the syllables as voiced or voiceless. So the Lisker and Abramson experiment first showed that synthesized VOT continuum for consonant and R syllables, and where in stable formant for R, stable state formant region for R was selected, and formant transitions related to the consonants were added, and 37 VOT variants were given to participants to hear. So there were 10 millisecond steps as well as 5 millisecond steps, and speakers of Latin American Spanish and 12 speakers of American English and 8 speakers of Thai participated. And subjects classified stimuli using orthographic labels, as we had discussed. The way forced identification experiments are conducted based on orthographic labels, where participants are asked whether a sound is ba or a pa. So categorical perception is important because it has been shown that typically non-speech stimuli vary acoustically along a single continuum and are perceived continuously, resulting in discrimination functions that are monotonic with a physical scale. However, as Lieberman and colleagues had shown, speech is special. A lot of research has ensued in perception research and has shown a perception, speech perception can also be continuous. However, this lecture does not cover the greater details of the perception research. So, speech perception research and ability to perceive speech has been shown in the research to be based on cues. As we had already said, cues, that's the information which help us to extract the most important information so that we can discriminate contrasts, and so that we the word recognition process is optimum. And speech perception experiments based on synthetic edited speech have been used to establish the perceptual significance of a wide variety of acoustic correlates of linguistic contrasts. So, recall our lectures on formants, which showed that oral cavity and the pharyngeal cavity modulates the speech spectra, which is generated from the glottal region. And we have seen all these resonance chambers and how the spectra is modulated by the vocal tracts. So this is the source filter theory. This is how sound is produced and filtered in the vocal tract. And after we looked at these things, we talked about how these sources serve as input for the vocal tract filter, which modulates the input as different frequency components of the source are passed through the filter. So, for the production of sounds, all these sources can be combined: the glottal source, the vocal tract filter, and the frequency components. So, and after the combination of all the sources, we have the peculiar properties of nasals, liquids, glides, and also stops and fricatives. So, nasals, liquids, and glides have periodic glottal source with vowels, but their filtering effects are more complicated. Vocal tract filtering effects for vowels are modeled as resonances of coupled tubes, each of which was open at the end, but it's modeled slightly differently for these consonants. It's modeled as closed at one end, and So, it's a closed tube. During the production of nasal consonants, the velum is lowered and the pathway from the pharynx to the nasal passage is open and air flows from the lungs through the nostrils. In nasal stops, the mouth cavity is closed off by a complete constriction in the vocal tract. And also recall that we talked about low F1 for nasals and around 250 to 200 hertz, and V curves, and in vowels the peaks are lower in amplitude. The release burst is very transient, brief transient noise which has a flat spectrum, and also voiceless stops is more energy than that of voice stops in the burst spectrum. The source spectra for aspiration and frication are nearly the same, that is the noise. Now, when it comes to perception, so all these things that we had studied as a result of the source filter theory of consonant production, now we have to be aware that all of this contributes to the perception of speech. So, when you talk about consonants, when you talk about manner of articulations, so the way stop completely stops the airflow, and other sounds like liquids, fricatives, glides and vowels have varying degree of occlusions, and lowering the velum causes nasal sounds. Place of articulation, which refers to the location of the occlusion in the vocal tract, and voicing is presence absence of the vocal fold vibration. Now, this is the most basic information about articulated phonetics that you already know from the previous lectures, and coupled with the major acoustic cues, that is stop, which has a low energy, and the voice bar that you saw for voice stops, and the burst that you saw for stops because of the release and the build up of pressure and the release, and place of articulation signaled by the spectrum of burst, and also the transition, which is very important, the form and transitions which we talked about. So, remember the period of silence that we talked about. There is a stop gap of 50 to 100 milliseconds, and there is a silence which we also talked about when we talked about in the last class. We talked about how that is compensated for, that silence is not not heard, and those things are actually cues for the perception of different consonants. So, phonemes, phonetic features like frication and acoustic cues like voicing and sibilance, etc., what we showed in acoustics, and those things contribute a lot in the perception of the sounds. So, noise generated as air is forced through a narrow constriction for fricatives, and that is filtered by the vocal tract, and transitions to and from the vowels due to changes in the vocal tract, and sibilants have intense noise energy and non-sibilants have weak non-energy. So, weak noise. So, the noise aspect which was stressed in the acoustic part is also very important in perception. And similarly for nasals, the spectrum is dominated by low frequency energy, etc., and also nasal pole and zero, which we had talked about yesterday, are also cues for nasals. And similarly for glides, a relatively slow transition from 75 to 100 milliseconds, and F1 of both the sounds starts very low. The important thing about glides is that there is this movement which is quite apparent in the acoustics, and that is also a cue for its perception. When it comes to the proximants la and ra, their acoustic cues are quite complex. So, they are both very fast moving form and transitions, and they have a well defined form and structure, and however, one should remember the F3 for L is especially lower, F1 is also low, and then there are some other cues like F1 is short steady state and long transition, F1 is long steady state for L and short transition. So even though the sounds are pretty similar, these are the timing of the F1 and the transition is different for L and R. So summarizing like yesterday, so these are the things which are important. So the stop, release, burst, the fricative noise, nasal pole 0 and F2 transitions for all of these is important for the place of articulation. For manner of articulation, the attenuation, the change, the energy, which is a burst in energy for stops, and the noise in fricatives, and the low amplitude in nasals, and that is important. And the abruptness in the stops, then the fricative noise, the slow hissing noise, and in nasals the amplitude difference, which makes a difference between the stop and a nasal, is an important cue. And also for glides, the difference between F2 and F3, which is not shown here, is also important. So let us also talk about, end this lecture on speech perception by discussing how speech is multimodal, which means it not only uses the articulatory medium, it also uses other mediums to for efficient communication. This is with regard to what is called the McGurk effect. So this is something which was first shown by McGurk. This is a very interesting experiment which shows the McGurk effect. There's a visual stimulus that shows a speaker saying ga ga. Auditory stimulus says a speaker says ba ba, and then the listeners hear da da, even though neither of the visual stimulus nor the auditory stimulus says da. So basically the listener hears something between ga and ba because there is a clash between the auditory stimulus and the visual stimulus. There is a sort of a trade-off and you hear something in between. However, if the eyes are closed, then the speaker hears what is said, and then when the eyes are closed, there is no clash with the visual medium. So as shown in this diagram, the speaker says ba ba and the lips says ga ga, and what is played is ba ba, but the perception is da da. So these are we have used some of our information from the MIT courseware on linguistic phonetics, and these are some of the papers that we have used to prepare our slides. Thank you very much for your attention, and we will continue with the course Phonetics and Phonology, a broad overview, in the following lectures. Thank you.